A desperate act became a rallying cause.
I am here to fight for my freedom and for my country.
Social networks pursuing social justice, organizing countrywide demonstrations, igniting national uprisings, triggering revolutions. As the Egyptian regime implodes,
I will die on Egyptian soil.
we ask, who and what's next in the Arab world? This is Empire. Hello and welcome to Empire. I am Marwan Bishara. The Arabs' time have finally come. The lie has been exposed. Change is within reach. Forced to choose between despotic regimes and foreign interventions, between oppressive stagnation and the threat of religious tyranny, the Arabs in Tunisia, Egypt, and elsewhere have chosen freedom. Freedom of expression, freedom from want, freedom from false choices. Never has personal and national dignity been so intertwined, so mutually reinforcing, so inspiring. Never has a national transformation come so suddenly, the stakes been so high, people so daring. Across the Arab world, the message on the street is loud and clear. People want their long-standing autocratic governments to go now. From Tunisia to Algeria to Jordan, Yemen, and Egypt.
I have asked the government to resign, and I will appoint a new one starting tomorrow.
The trigger for all this, one man, Mohammed Bouazizi, a jobless university graduate. He set himself on fire to protest conditions that many Arab youth find themselves in. Unemployment, poverty, lack of opportunity. And where Bouazizi left off, social media and satellite television picked up.
A very large segment of the population is under the age of 25. These are people who are often unemployed, have very limited prospects for good jobs and a good life, are politically also, in a sense, castrated because of the authoritarian practices of the regime.
The 1980s saw a wave of popular unrest reshape the world. The Iron Curtain was torn down, and one by one, the dominoes of Eastern Europe fell. In Latin America, autocratic strongmen were swept away by democratic forces, but not in the Arab world, where dictators have been around for decades. The strongmen have ruled using Israel as a pretext, rallying national sentiment to gain legitimacy, and then invoking emergency powers to counter the threat of the Zionist aggression. But why do autocrats proliferate in the Arab world?
There's an argument that Islam is antithetical to democracy and democratic practices and institutions. There's another theory that says that oil wealth prevents democracy from emerging because the state is much too powerful and much too wealthy to make any concessions to the people.
The West says it supports regime change as a result of popular uprising, and yet backs dictators who do their bidding. But in the Arab world, there is another paradigm.
There's the fear that Islamists would come to power and that Islamists would be against the West.
So what's different about this wave of protests?
There are much more people involved. The mass basis of these protests is much wider, first and foremost. Secondly, the level of violence so far has been wider. Hopefully we're not there, but we could well be at the brink of civil war.
The West's reaction to the current demand for more democracy in the Arab world has been lukewarm at best and slow to come.
An orderly transition must begin now.
In spite of that, Arab leaders are reacting and talking reform. Jordan's King Abdullah has sacked his entire government. and Yemeni President Ali Abdullah Saleh announced that he would quit at the end of his term in 2013.
There's no extension, no inheritance, no resetting the clock, as some have repeatedly claimed.
But the question is this enough? Joining me to discuss this breathtaking transformation sweeping the Arab world are Professor Rashid Khalidi. You're a professor of modern Arab studies at Columbia University and author of Sowing Crisis, the Cold War and American Dominance in the Middle East. Clovis Maqsood, you're a professor of international relations and director of the Center of the Global South at the American University in Washington, D.C., former chief representative of the League of Arab States to the United States and the United Nations, author of numerous books, including The Crisis of the Arab Left. Samer Shahata, you're a professor of Arab politics at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University, author of Shop Floor Culture and Politics in Egypt. Gentlemen, welcome to Empire. I'm going to start with you, Ambassador Maqsood. It's been 6 weeks since Bouaziz set himself on fire. An event and 6 weeks that shook the world, but will they transform the region?
What we have is Arab unity and Arab fragmentation. Arab fragmentation on the top and Arab unity on the bottom. So what happened in Tunisia more or less expedited the transformative factor and the breakthrough in Egypt.
So you think there is no turning back?
I don't think it's irreversible.
Professor Khalidi, put this for us in a historical perspective. The Arab world has been in stagnation now for 3 decades. Since bin Ali took over in 1987, before him Ali Abdullah Saleh of Yemen in 1978, this region had seen no change, certainly not in Egypt. How do you see this transformation in historical perspective?
I think what we're seeing now is a breakup, somewhat similar to what happened immediately after World War I, when you had Woodrow Wilson, the idea of self-determination, and suddenly all over the Arab world there were revolts, there were uprisings, which had the same kind of demands for liberal constitutional forms, an end to external control, greater social justice. Even with a repressive police state, such as has been in place in Egypt for decades, Egypt has a sort of cultural radiance, and when Egypt shakes, as it's shaking now, the entire Arab world feels it. Egypt is the most important country in the Arab world. It's the biggest, it's the intellectual center, it's the media center.
Samer, we've seen that succeed already in Tunisia. It looks like the Mubarak regime is imploding. Are you optimistic about change in Egypt?
Yes, certainly, and sometimes no. But I think that the point of the transformation is certainly already occurring. There's no question about that. Whether the regime continues in one form or another for a week, for a month, until the elections in 2011, or even longer, there's certainly been a transformation in Egypt. It's been a radical one. We have not seen, and correct me if I'm wrong, this number of protesters all across the country in Egypt protesting and politically aware. That is, these are not, labor protests. These are not protests about inflation and so on, with one goal since 1919. Unfortunately, however, I think, authoritarian regimes sometimes manage to get through crises in one way or another, sometimes transformed. So I think the question now is to what extent what we're seeing will be structurally transformative of the Egyptian political system. And it's not clear that it will necessarily lead to a democratic political system. We have to be hopeful, and I think people have to continue struggling, but that's not certainly determined.
So we know there is a break with the past, but we don't know how they will define the future. But before we do that, Professor Maqsood, we're all surprising ourselves. It seems Egyptians themselves are being surprised by what they are doing themselves. I mean, where is Ayman Zawahiri? Where is Al-Qaeda now? Where is the so-called Islamic fundamentalist jihadists and so on and so forth? Where has this Arab streak been? It's like as if it's been invisible, and all of a sudden it's shocking itself and the rest of the world.
What you are experiencing is that this very peaceful and enlightened and spontaneous mobilization that has taken place all over Egypt had on Thursday, unfortunately last week, the baptism in blood. This, paradoxically, is going to cement further the will and the determination to undertake a liberal Arab nationalist with a cognizance that Islam has to be coping with the modernistic challenges and the liberal challenges. And I think that the blending process that is taking place among the fragmented opposition historically in Egypt has now blended together into a synthesis which provides an organizing system for this mass movement, and on the other hand might provide it a sense of clear direction.
People's power, Rashid.
Well, I think one of the most important things we're seeing is the shattering of a narrative that was peddled by the Arab regimes, by the neocons in this country, by Israel, which is that you either have repressive police states or you have wild Islamic fundamentalists. The liberal nature, the democratic aspirations, the desire for social justice of the Egyptian people has nothing to do with
like
that
the
picture.
Tunisians before them.
Like the Tunisians before them. What is erupting here is the reality of the Arab world that has been masked by this lying narrative peddled by the regimes. It's either us or the devil.
Right.
In other words, you accept police state torture, you accept beating up of people outside the polling places, you accept the kind of horrors that...
And now the silent majority is out.
They're out in the streets, and the amazing thing is the demands are developing, starting with Tunis, now what we're seeing in Egypt, and it's beginning in other Arab countries. And so far, one of the astonishing things is there's been no prominence of either an Islamic or a left or a right or a center. It's a remarkable mix of the various trends that actually existed within this society and that were masked by this ridiculous narrative that we were peddled.
I agree completely with Professor Khalidi, but I would say I don't think it was necessarily the case 2 or 3 decades ago even that the segments of the population in Egypt that are protesting now would have shared equally the ideas of the necessity of free and fair elections regularly held, limitations on the executive, a pluralistic order, and a modern concept of citizenship of equal rights. So I think that the demographic changes that have taken place, of course, I think the kind of global acceptance of the importance of civil society playing a role and so on, separate from the state to a large extent, the kind of recognition of the importance of media freedoms and so on by broad segments of the population, including Islamist groups and so on, that this also has made a more pluralistic future possible. I don't think that was necessarily the case 3 decades ago.
But the thing is, what we see from the demonstrators thus far, this national uprising, whether in Tunisia or Egypt, or even in other places that we're watching now, in Yemen or Jordan or in other places, they are young, they are industrious, they are inspiring, they are inspired, they are ethical. Where have we seen this ever anywhere? So there is something completely promising in what's going on, judging from what we see.
Oh, I think there's a great deal of promise. And in fact, these regimes have very effectively used the bogeyman of Islamist fundamentalism. And in fact, we're hearing it again in this country, in the United States at least, with the comparison of Iran in 1979, very effectively to provide a false choice to Western governments and Western
So you don't
publics.
think this is going
I don't think it's
in that
going.
direction?
I don't think it's going that way at all. Now, that doesn't mean
because
that
even the Muslim Brotherhood was even part of this, organizing those demonstrations.
Well, the Muslim Brotherhood didn't participate in the January 25th demonstrations, the original large demonstrations, which took many of us for granted.
Nor in
That
the
was
April
police
6th
day.
before that,
That
right?
was police day, exactly. And of course, their justification was that it's a national holiday and so on, and we recognize the legitimacy of the police and their accomplishments. There was another factor, of course, which is whenever the Muslim Brotherhood participates in demonstrations and protests along with other groups, they receive the brunt of regime burden, of regime repression.
But there's
and so
absolutely
on.
no problem at all with having Muslim Brotherhood participate in any future elections and so on and so forth.
The overwhelming initiative that has been taken by the young groups forced every single traditional party existing prior to to modify and blend with the others. So there is no longer a polarization between the left and the Muslim Brotherhood, between the liberal and the left, etc. So there is a blending process. Now my worry and my anxiety is that with the response of the United States, which more or less becomes a facilitator given the strategic interests of the United States in the region, my worry and my concern is that the values of the United States that have been proclaimed by President Obama and amplified by the Secretary Clinton.
The rhetoric of values.
The rhetoric of that has been very positive and persuading. However, the strategic thrust of the United States in the region still maintains Israel as a pivot. And in that sense, it is important that to fulfill the total anxiety and the total renaissance of this great revolution in Egypt is that somehow or the other, Egypt has to retrieve its deterrent power against the Israeli expansion and aggression.
Here's where the trick is, Rashid, is that the United States is trying to maintain a close relationship with the Egyptian army. So my question to you is the following. The demonstrations might be calling for replacing President Mubarak, the person, but in fact, will there be serious change on the long term unless the Mubarak regime is changed?
The question is, will there continue to be a police state apparatus in Egypt that determines outcomes when this movement has succeeded or when this movement has come to its peak?
But would you trust the regime today to lead the transitional movement?
I'm not in Egypt. I'm not an Egyptian. It's up to the Egyptians to decide that. But this is my concern. It's not so much the army, and it's not even so much Egypt's foreign policy at this stage. It's whether the police state apparatus will be tamed in the way it was in Tunis. Every single governor in Tunisia has been fired. Most of the police commanders have been fired. A general from the army, actually an admiral, has taken over the Ministry of the Interior. That is a step that has to take place in Egypt if it is to be free.
So the army has to be, and the security forces need to be taken out of the political system.
In the first instance, the security forces have to be removed from the political equation.
Well, hence the vice president too, Mr. Omar Suleiman.
Well,
the prime minister and many other
and
cabinet,
a whole bunch of,
and that's why I think many people in Egypt have very, very little credibility in a future that simply has Mubarak removed. In other words, the fear is a Mubarak regime without Mubarak, and that's certainly not going to be good for democracy. Now, we have heard promises for decades, and some of the same language, in fact.
From some of the same people.
From some of the same people, this idea of a national dialogue and so on, reaching out to the opposition. This was Safwat al-Sharif's discourse in the 1990s. It is clearly demonstrated that many of the people who have been appointed, the vice president, the prime minister, and so on, are deeply entwined in this regime for decades. So there would have to be major.
Interrupt you. The person who was in charge of the Egyptian security apparatus, in charge of torture, in charge of the secret police, is now the vice president. If that regime stays in place, there will be no democracy and there will be no change. It's not a matter of the man Mubarak or even the man Omar Suleiman.
Completely.
It is that secret police apparatus running things in Egypt or not.
And hence...
that is what changed in Tunis.
Yes.
That was the key thing that changed in Tunis.
And hence, to broaden the picture a bit and take it to the rest of the region, what's going to happen in Egypt, of course, as a model, is going to have a huge influence on what goes on in the rest of the region. So I ask you, just generally, who's next? What's going to happen next in the Middle East?
It's not the question of only next. It is that Egypt's weight has been totally paralyzed by the former regime, and particularly not only by corruption, not only by dictatorship, but also by the fact that it has removed its national role on the Arab scale.
So you think now that the rise of Egypt is possible? You think that will lead to the domino effect in the region?
Of course, it would have a dominant effect.
Or domino effect?
Well, dominant effect, but domino not yet. Of course, we can see signs in Yemen, we can see signs in Jordan.
People speaking of Pakistan, Ambassador, now.
You know, the most important thing, the test ultimately, is that internal democratization and distribution of wealth from those who have monopolized wealth. That's on the one hand. Second is its role in the Arab world, its role on the Palestinian question.
Ambassador, you think the test will be for them to lift the siege of Gaza, for example?
Yes, to lift one, and also to realize that the Palestinian Authority, which support and solidarized with Mr. Abbas, with Mubarak. I think that was a moment of clarifying what is the ultimate substance of the satellitization of the West Bank.
So being a client of a client of a client now in the Arab world is probably over.
I think that is the role that Egypt has to resume by remobilizing the resistance culture.
Hence, it can no longer be a client of a foreign power.
Never. I think it should never be a client. It should be friendly, and should resume its role as a guiding force in our foreign policy.
We must, as we wind up the show, we must broaden the picture to the rest of the region.
That's right.
It's clear that if politics is perception, and to a large degree in the Arab world it is, it's breathtaking, the speed of change. So if we've moved 6 weeks from a man setting himself on fire to a country, a regime is being brought down, certainly this is going to move forward into the rest of the Arab world, no?
Well, I mean, this is a regional system, right? People have to remember that these aren't simply states that border each other, that the Arab world is a regional system with common language, common history. So we've already seen this tsunami spread, whether it's a domino effect or not, as we can talk about. I think that some countries are much more susceptible to potential significant change and so on than others. I mean, Yemen clearly and Algeria. I think that it is less likely, although not impossible, that certain countries in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia and so on, will face a similar kind of fate. But those are different political systems with different political structures.
And as I said earlier, now, the countries like Pakistan, a country of 100 and etc. some million, is also now worried because of the similarities. They all suffer, Rashid, from the same ills of corruption, badly run system, autocratic governance, and so on and so forth.
This might have an effect outside the Arab world, but I think the key thing here is that there is an Arab public sphere. The walls that the regimes have erected, and which Arab satellite television and which social media have broken down in some ways, have now been broken politically. People are borrowing methods from one country to another. People are taking inspiration from one country to another. Even if this is, heaven forbid, repressed in Egypt, as it may be for a time, something has changed now. Everybody understands that this is a region that's linked and that everybody has the same aspirations. People are taking heart from what happened in Tunisia and now from what's happening in Egypt, and I think change is beginning all over this region.
So the virus of democracy has spread?
No question.
Well, on this positive note, gentlemen, thank you for joining Empire, and I will be back with a last thought. I would like to end on a personal note. For those of us who grew up in the Arab world, life has been one long nightmare shaped by political failures, military defeats, social regress, and economic stagnation. But spring has come early this year. Never have I witnessed such widespread vigor and yearning for change. Yes, the situation remains difficult, but remember, the darkest moments of the night come just before dawn. Call me a romantic. I believe in the words of the Tunisian poet Abdelkader Shabi. If people will to live, providence is destined to favorably respond, and night is destined to fold, and the chains are certain to be broken. That's the way it goes. Until next time.